been very negative. Understandably, it's such a large issue that everyone feels completely overwhelmed by the facts, the scale of the problems and things like that.
The revelation. In the dying light of an October evening, when the ancient stones of Windsor cast their longest shadows across perfectly manicured lawns, two figures stood on opposite sides of a threshold that had divided them for more than 5 years. The moment had arrived with the stealth of dawn, unannounced and unexpected, yet carrying with it the weight of a kingdom's hope and a family's unspoken prayers. The confirmation came not through official palace channels, nor through the carefully orchestrated press releases that typically herald royal movements. Instead, it arrived in whispers, in the subtle movements of security personnel who materialized at locations they had no scheduled reason to patrol, in the conspicuous absence of certain advisors from their usual posts, and in the sudden, unexplained gaps in both princes' public schedules that afternoon. For those who have watched the House of Windsor navigate its turbulent recent history, the signs were unmistakable. The same patterns that preceded previous moments of royal reconciliation, the same carefully choreographed dance of discretion that has protected the monarchy's most private deliberations for centuries, had emerged once again. But this time the stakes felt impossibly higher. William, the heir apparent, had spent the morning at a foundation meeting in London, his demeanor reportedly calm but distant, his mind clearly occupied with matters beyond the charitable initiatives being discussed. Staff members noted the unusual tension in his jawline, the way his gaze would drift toward windows overlooking the Thames, as if searching for something in the gray English sky that refused to reveal itself. Across the Atlantic, Harry had boarded a private flight from California in the hours before dawn, his departure timed with the precision that only those trained in royal protocol could execute. The flight manifest, later scrutinized by those with access to such information, showed a passenger list of precisely 3 individuals: Harry, a single security officer, and a confidential advisor whose name would not appear in any subsequent reporting. The brothers had not stood face to face in any meaningful capacity since the Queen's funeral more than 3 years prior. That day, grief had provided a temporary armistice, a shared sorrow that momentarily eclipsed their differences. But grief is a finite resource, and when its shadow receded, the chasm between them had seemed only to widen, deepened by interviews, by memoir revelations, by the relentless machinery of media speculation that fed on every photographed glance and analyzed every absent interaction. Yet something had shifted. Palace insiders, speaking only under conditions of absolute anonymity, suggested that the catalyst had emerged not from either brother directly, but from a third party whose identity remained shrouded in deliberate mystery. Some whispered of Princess Anne, the unflinching pragmatist who had watched her nephew's relationship deteriorate with increasing frustration. Others suggested King Charles himself, now 18 months into his reign, and painfully aware that his legacy would be judged not merely by his own actions but by the unity or fracture of the generation that would follow him. The location chosen for this unprecedented meeting spoke volumes about its nature. Not Buckingham Palace with its gilded halls and watchful portraits of ancestors who had navigated their own family conflicts. Not Kensington Palace, where William's presence would cast the meeting in the light of home advantage. And certainly not Frogmore Cottage, the residence that had become synonymous with Harry and Meghan's departure from royal life, now standing empty and symbolic of all that had been lost. Instead, the neutral ground selected was Adelaide Cottage, a grace and favor property within Windsor's private grounds that William and his family had called home since 2022. The choice was deliberate in its intimacy, suggesting a meeting not of formal reconciliation but of brotherly conversation, conducted away from the apparatus of monarchy that had so often complicated their relationship. As afternoon surrendered to evening, vehicles arrived at Windsor through gates that the public never sees, along roads that appear on no tourist maps. The security perimeter expanded silently, professionally, and invisibly, creating a bubble of privacy that would be maintained with the same dedication as that which protects matters of state security. Whatever would unfold in the hours ahead would unfold away from cameras, away from commentary, away from the judgment of a world that had consumed every detail of their estrangement with insatiable appetite. Inside Adelaide Cottage, fires were lit in rooms where difficult conversations would soon take place. Staff retreated to distant corners of the property under strict instructions that their presence would not be required this evening. The stage was set for a drama that the public would only understand through fragments and implications, through the careful analysis of what would be said in the days that followed, and through the presence or absence of the brothers at future events. The weight of expectation surrounding this moment extended far beyond the personal reconciliation of two siblings. The monarchy itself, that ancient institution that has survived wars and abdications, scandals and revolutions, now faced questions about its relevance in an age of transparency and accountability. Harry's departure and his subsequent revelations had exposed fault lines that traditionalists insisted did not exist. His accusations of institutional racism, of a media operation willing to sacrifice individuals for favorable coverage, of a family structure that prioritized hierarchy over humanity, had reverberated through Commonwealth nations and challenged assumptions about the Crown's moral authority. William, meanwhile, had absorbed these public criticisms while maintaining the stoic silence expected of a future king. He had continued his duties, expanded his initiatives around homelessness and mental health, and projected an image of stability that palace officials desperately needed after years of turmoil. But those close to him understood the personal cost of this restraint, the anger and hurt that simmered beneath the composed exterior, the sense of betrayal that came not merely from Harry's departure, but from the manner of it, and from the public processing of private grievances. As darkness settled over Windsor, both men approached the threshold of Adelaide Cottage from different directions, carrying with them not just years of accumulated grievances, but also decades of shared history. They were brothers who had walked behind their mother's coffin together, who had served in military uniform side by side, who had once been described as inseparable in their understanding of the unique burden they carried, as the only two people in their generation who could truly comprehend what it meant to be born into the House of Windsor. The door opened, and the conversation that would define their relationship for decades to come was finally allowed to begin. The path to reconciliation. The journey that brought both princes to this singular moment had been neither swift nor straightforward. It had required the collapse of pride, the intervention of wisdom, and the slow recognition that stubbornness, however justified it might feel, extracts a price that eventually becomes too heavy to bear. For William, the shift began in an unexpected place during a visit to a youth mentorship program in Manchester 6 weeks earlier. A teenager, emboldened by the informal setting, had asked him directly about forgiveness, not about Harry specifically, but about whether it was possible to forgive someone who had hurt you in public, whether reconciliation required forgetting, whether strength meant holding firm to your anger or finding the courage to release it. William had answered carefully, diplomatically, as he always did, but the question had lodged itself somewhere deep, returning to him during quiet moments when his children played in the gardens of Adelaide Cottage, when he watched George interact with Charlotte and Louis, when he contemplated the relationships his own children would navigate as they grew. The parallel was unavoidable. He and Harry had once been what his children were now, innocent of the conflicts that would eventually find them, unaware that love and duty would one day seem to stand in opposition. The Prince of Wales had confided in Catherine, as he did with all matters that troubled him beyond the capacity of formal counsel to resolve. The princess, who had known both brothers during happier years and who carried her own complex feelings about how events had unfolded, had listened with the patience that had become her signature. She did not push, did not advocate for any particular course, but asked questions that William needed to hear. What did he want his children to know about their uncle? What story did he want to tell himself about this chapter when he was older? What would he regret more, reaching out or remaining silent? The conversations stretched across days and weeks. Catherine understood that her husband needed to arrive at this decision through his own reasoning, rather than under pressure or persuasion. The institution of monarchy might demand specific responses, but the beating heart of a brother required its own counsel. Harry's path was no less complicated. The move to California had provided physical distance but not emotional resolution. The memoir he had published, while commercially successful and personally cathartic, had not delivered the peace he had anticipated. Instead, it had created new complications, new criticisms, new reasons for estrangement. Meghan had watched her husband carry the burden of this family rupture with increasing concern, understanding that the wounds he bore were older and deeper than their relationship, that they connected to his mother's death and to the years of institutional life that had followed. In therapy sessions that Harry had discussed publicly as part of his mental health advocacy, he had begun to examine not just what had been done to him, but his own role in how the rupture had deepened. The work was uncomfortable, requiring him to hold multiple truths simultaneously. He could acknowledge genuine harm, while also recognizing his own contributions to the conflict. He could understand systemic problems within the institution, while also seeing the individuals within it as complex human beings struggling with their own constraints and fears. The catalyst, when it finally emerged, came from an unexpected source. Princess Anne, the king's sister, and the family member perhaps least inclined toward sentimentality, had reached out to both nephews separately. Her message was characteristically direct. The family could continue as it was, fractured and defensive, using silence as a weapon and distance as a shield. Or it could attempt something more difficult, more uncertain, and ultimately more honest. Anne made no promises about outcomes. She did not suggest that a single conversation would heal years of hurt, but she posed a question that neither brother could easily dismiss. In 10 years, in 20, when their own children asked them about this period, what would they say? That they had tried and failed, or that they had never tried at all? The subsequent logistics were handled with military precision, appropriate given both brothers' service backgrounds. Dates were proposed and refined. Security arrangements were coordinated across international boundaries. The circle of knowledge was kept impossibly tight, limited to fewer than 10 individuals who understood that any leak would not merely embarrass the family, but would poison the possibility of genuine conversation. King Charles, upon being informed of the planned meeting, responded with characteristic emotion. The king's own relationship with both sons was complicated, marked by years of trying to be both father and sovereign, often succeeding at neither to his own satisfaction. He did not interfere in the arrangements, understanding that some conversations needed to happen between brothers alone, without the weight of parental expectation or royal hierarchy. The timing was chosen with deliberate care. William's children would be at school, their routine undisturbed. Harry's arrival would be timed to avoid the periods when press attention on royal movements was highest. The meeting would occur on what appeared to be an ordinary Thursday, unremarkable in every way except for what it would represent to those who knew it was happening. As Harry's plane descended toward British airspace, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always accompanied returns to his homeland. England was no longer home, but it remained the landscape of his formation, the place where every significant memory of his first 30 years resided. Flying over the countryside he knew so well, he thought about the last time he had seen William with any genuine openness between them, struggling to identify precisely when the ease of their relationship had begun its slow collapse. William, preparing for his brother's arrival, moved through his home with unusual restlessness. He checked rooms that needed no checking, adjusted furniture that was already perfectly placed, caught himself in small rituals of anxiety that reminded him of waiting for exam results or military evaluations. The anticipation was physical, manifesting in tension across his shoulders and a slight nausea that no amount of rational thought could dispel. Both men understood that this meeting could unfold in multiple directions. It could be the beginning of a slow thaw, a gradual rebuilding of trust that would take years to realize fully. It could be a single conversation that provided closure without reconciliation, allowing both to move forward with clarity, if not unity. Or it could collapse into recrimination, each man feeling vindicated in his previous decision to maintain distance, convinced that the gulf between them was simply too vast to bridge. The one certainty was that the meeting would happen. After years of silence, of communication conducted through lawyers and statements, of family events navigated with careful physical distance, William and Harry would finally sit in the same room and speak the words that had accumulated like floodwater behind a failing dam. The sun was setting over Windsor as Harry's vehicle passed through the final security checkpoint. In the cottage, William stood by a window, watching the approach. Neither man could yet know what the evening would bring, whether this would be remembered as the night the House of Windsor found its way back to unity, or as another chapter in a generational tragedy unfolding in real time. The vehicle stopped, the door opened, and the final steps of a journey measured in years and miles and oceans of hurt were finally completed. Behind closed doors, the first minutes unfolded with the awkward formality of strangers who once knew each other intimately. William stood as Harry entered, the physical contrast between them somehow more pronounced than in photographs had been. William, settled into the gravitas of his role, carried himself with the weight of inevitability. Harry, tanned from California's sun and dressed more casually than any working royal would dare, seemed simultaneously younger and older than his brother, as if their divergent paths had aged them at different rates. The initial greeting was minimal, a brief nod, a gesture toward the sitting room where staff had prepared tea that would likely go untouched. No handshake, no embrace, nothing that would suggest this was anything other than what it was. Two men who shared blood and history but little else in their present lives, attempting to find language for a conversation that felt both urgently necessary and possibly futile. William spoke first, his words measured and careful. He acknowledged Harry's journey, the logistics of arranging this meeting, and the mutual agreement to privacy that had made it possible. The Prince of Wales was doing what he had been trained to do, establishing parameters, creating structure, and maintaining control of an interaction that threatened to spiral into chaos if left unchecked. Harry listened, then responded with similar caution. He thanked William for agreeing to meet, for being willing to attempt dialogue despite the years of silence and the public nature of their disagreements. But beneath the courtesy, tension thrummed like a plucked string, the barely contained energy of everything unsaid seeking expression. The weather was discussed, the children were mentioned neutrally as facts rather than as emotional connection points. These preliminary exchanges served a purpose, allowing both men to calibrate their tone, test the atmosphere, and determine whether genuine conversation was possible or whether this would remain an exercise in diplomatic restraint. Then William asked a question that completely shifted the tenor. Why had Harry come? Not logistically, not in response to whose invitation, but deeper. What did he hope to achieve in this meeting? What did he need to say that warranted flying 5,000 miles to say it in person? The directness was characteristic of William, his tendency to move past the preamble when patience expired. However, it also represented risk, an opening that could lead to either authenticity or confrontation. Harry paused before answering, visibly weighing his words. He spoke about their mother, about Diana's hope that her sons would protect each other, support each other, and remain united against the pressures that would inevitably come. He acknowledged that both had failed that promise in different ways, through action and inaction, through words spoken and through silences maintained. He admitted that his own choices had contributed to their estrangement, that in his determination to protect his own family, he had perhaps been insufficiently protective of the relationship with his brother. The mention of Diana created a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. She remained the ghost at every Windsor gathering, the absence that shaped so much of how both men understood family, duty, and the cost of royal life. For both William and Harry, their mother was the measuring stick against which all other relationships were evaluated, the source of their deepest wounds, and their most profound understanding of love. William's response was quiet but intense. He spoke about duty not as abstraction, but as daily reality, the constant weight of knowing that his choices would define the monarchy for his children and grandchildren. He described the isolation of being heir, of watching Harry walk away from the institution while he remained bound to it, obligated to defend it even when he understood its flaws, required to embody continuity, even when continuity felt like imprisonment. The honesty was unexpected, a crack in the careful composure that William typically maintained. For perhaps the first time in years, he allowed Harry to see not the Prince of Wales, but the man underneath, the brother who felt abandoned and betrayed, who resented being cast as representative of an oppressive institution when he too struggled against its constraints. Harry listened without interruption, and in that listening, something began to shift. The narrative he had constructed, necessary for his own survival and justification, began to admit complexity. William was not merely the institution's defender, but also its prisoner. His brother's silence in the face of Harry's public revelations had not been indifference but restraint demanded by a role he had not chosen, but could not escape. The conversation began to circle the most difficult territories: the media, and whose responsibility it was to correct false stories; the memoir, and which revelations William considered unforgivable breaches of family trust; Meghan, and whether the institution had protected her or failed her; the children growing up as cousins who were strangers; the question of whether return was possible or whether Harry's departure was permanent. There were moments when voices rose, when old grievances demanded expression, when years of accumulated hurt sought release through anger. But neither man allowed the conversation to deteriorate completely. They had come too far, risked too much to let this dissolve into the patterns that had failed them before. William asked Harry if he regretted leaving. Harry's answer was carefully constructed. He regretted how it had happened, the pain it had caused, the permanent nature of some of the ruptures it had created. But he could not regret the decision itself, could not wish himself back into a situation that had threatened his mental health and his marriage. He had chosen his wife and children, and he would make that choice again. The admission hung between them, honest and difficult. William nodded slowly, processing what it meant. Harry had chosen his family over their family. It was not malicious, not even wrong exactly, but it was a hierarchy that could not be ignored. In turn, William acknowledged what he had perhaps never said directly, that he understood more than Harry might believe, that he too had moments of wanting to walk away, of resenting the burden, of envying the freedom that Harry had claimed. But his choices were constrained by birth order, by the inevitability of succession, by children who would face even greater scrutiny. He could not follow Harry's path, even if he wanted to. As evening deepened toward night, the conversation began to shift from accusation toward something resembling understanding. They would not emerge as the brothers they had once been. Too much had happened, too many words had been spoken publicly, too many wounds had been inflicted with intent. But perhaps they could find a different relationship, one built on acceptance rather than expectation, on honesty about their differences rather than pretense about their unity. Harry asked about George, Charlotte, and Louis, wanting to know them as individuals rather than as names in occasional news reports. William asked about Archie and Lilibet, his niece and nephew who existed for him mainly as photographs. In these questions, in the genuine interest both men showed in each other's children, the possibility of forward movement existed. The meeting was not a resolution, it was an opening. A recognition that silence had served neither of them well, that the binary choice between complete reconciliation and permanent estrangement might admit other possibilities. They would not be working royals together again. They would not likely be each other's closest confidants, but they might find a way to be brothers again, even if that brotherhood looked different than it once had. As midnight approached, both men were exhausted, drained by the emotional intensity of hours spent navigating years of damage. They agreed to speak again, though when and how remained undefined. They agreed that this conversation would remain private, that the public would not be treated to another spectacle of Windsor family dynamics, and they agreed tentatively that the door between them need not remain permanently closed. The goodbye was less awkward than the greeting, though still far from warm, but something had shifted, some small crack in the wall between them that might, with time and continued effort, widen into a passage. Ripples in the crown. The immediate aftermath of the meeting unfolded in silence, in the conspicuous absence of official statements and the careful non-denial of palace sources when questioned about unusual security patterns at Windsor. For those trained to read royal signals, the silence itself spoke volumes. Denials would have been swift if the meeting had not occurred. The lack of denial, coupled with the sudden unavailability of key advisors for comment, told its own story. King Charles learned of the meeting's conclusion through a brief private communication from William the following morning. The message conveyed little detail, but confirmed that the conversation had taken place, that it had remained civil, and that both brothers had agreed to maintain privacy. For the king, who had watched his son's relationship deteriorate while feeling helpless to intervene, the news brought cautious relief. He knew better than to expect immediate reconciliation, but the fact that they had talked, truly talked, represented progress he had feared might never come. The king's own complicated relationships with both sons weighed heavily in these calculations. Charles had spent decades trying to be the father his own father had not been, attempting warmth and engagement while also preparing William for kingship and supporting Harry's search for a meaningful role within the institution. The balancing act had satisfied no one fully, least of all Charles himself, who carried guilt about his failures, even as he resented the impossibility of the task. Queen Camilla, informed of the meeting by her husband, responded with her characteristic pragmatism. She had watched the family drama unfold from her unique position, both inside and outside the core Windsor dynamic. Her perspective, shared quietly with Charles in private moments, was that the brothers' relationship would never return to what it had been, but that perhaps it did not need to. Different could be acceptable if different meant functional. In California, Meghan received Harry's account of the evening with mixed emotions. She supported her husband's need for this conversation, understood that his relationship with William was separate from their marriage, and accepted that some wounds could only be addressed directly. But she also carried her own hurt, her own sense of abandonment by the institution and, by extension, the family who had not defended her when she felt most vulnerable. The conversation between the brothers had not included her, and while rationally she understood why, emotionally, the exclusion stung. The children on both sides of the Atlantic remained largely unaware of the meeting's significance. For George, Charlotte, and Louis, Uncle Harry was already more myth than reality, a figure who appeared in old photographs and occasional video calls, but who had no presence in their daily lives. For Archie and Lilibet, the extended royal family was equally abstract, people they knew existed but did not know as family in any meaningful sense. Catherine learned details from William in the days following the meeting, during long walks through Windsor's private grounds where conversations could unfold without staff or security overhearing. The Princess of Wales had her own complex feelings about Harry's departure and subsequent revelations. Still, she recognized that her husband needed space to process this renewed contact with his brother without her judgment or advice. She asked questions rather than offering opinions, allowing William to articulate his own understanding of what the meeting had accomplished and what remained unresolved. The palace machinery, that intricate web of private secretaries, communications directors, and advisors who managed the public face of the monarchy, began subtle recalibrations. Contingency plans for future events were reviewed. The possibility that Harry might attend certain family occasions, previously dismissed as unlikely, was now being entertained as a possibility. Press strategies were adjusted to account for a relationship status that was neither reconciled nor permanently fractured. Media speculation intensified in the absence of official confirmation. Tabloids ran stories based on anonymous sources of varying credibility. Commentators analyzed every photograph of William in the days following the rumored meeting, searching for evidence in his demeanor or expression. Harry's return flight to California was tracked and reported, the timing analyzed for clues about how long he had remained in England and whether additional meetings had occurred. The Commonwealth realms watched these developments with particular interest. In nations where the monarchy's role remained contested, where Harry's public statements had amplified questions about institutional racism and colonial history, the possibility of family reconciliation carried political implications. Unity within the Windsor family projected stability. Continued fracture suggested an institution struggling to adapt to contemporary values. Within the broader family, reactions varied. Some members felt relief that William and Harry had finally spoken, hoping this might ease the tension that had permeated every family gathering for years. Others worried that renewed contact would simply provide opportunity for fresh hurt, that the brothers were fundamentally incompatible in their visions for their lives, and that attempting to bridge that gap was futile. Princess Anne maintained her typical discretion, offering no public comment and minimal private observation. However, those close to her understood that she felt vindicated in her decision to encourage both nephews to engage in this conversation. Whether it led to full reconciliation or simply to a less hostile distance, the attempt itself had value. Prince Edward and Sophie, who had maintained quiet contact with both brothers throughout the estrangement, hoped that this meeting might allow for more normal family interactions going forward. They had children of similar ages to both William and Harry's families, and the artificial separation between cousins who should know each other had troubled them deeply. The question of future public appearances became central to planning discussions. The king's next birthday celebration, still months away, would require decisions about invitation lists and coordination. The coronation anniversary, similarly distant but approaching, would need to account for the possibility of Harry's attendance. Every royal engagement that might traditionally include both brothers required new consideration. William and Harry themselves engaged in sporadic communication in the weeks following their meeting, though not with the frequency or ease that characterized their relationship a decade earlier. Text messages were exchanged, brief and somewhat formal but representing contact where previously there had been none. Topics remained safely neutral, focused on children and weather, and shared memories that predated their estrangement. The brothers had not solved the fundamental tensions between them. William remained committed to the institution that Harry had rejected. Harry remained protective of the independence he had claimed, unwilling to subordinate his family's well-being to institutional demands. The differences in their situations, in their obligations and freedoms, created practical barriers to genuine closeness, but they had established that conversation was possible, that they could sit in a room together without the interaction dissolving into accusation or defense. It was not friendship, barely qualified as reconciliation, but it was more than the frozen silence that had preceded it. In the context of where they had been, this represented meaningful progress. The meeting's most significant impact might ultimately be symbolic rather than practical. For a public that had watched the brothers' estrangement play out in real time, the simple fact that they had spoken, privately and without media orchestration, suggested that healing was possible even when divisions seemed permanent. The narrative of irreparable damage, of a family so broken it could never find its way back to even basic functionality, had been challenged if not entirely disproven. For the institution of monarchy itself, the meeting offered a different kind of hope. The crown had survived scandals and abdications, divorces and deaths, but it had not yet proven that it could accommodate members who chose to leave while maintaining family bonds with those who remained. Harry's departure had raised questions about whether royal duty and personal happiness were fundamentally incompatible. The possibility that he and William might find a relationship despite their different paths suggested that perhaps they were not. Unwritten futures. The question that occupied royal watchers, historians, and family members alike in the aftermath of the confirmed meeting, the answer, frustratingly for those seeking narrative tidiness, was that no one could know. The brothers had opened a door, but neither had committed to walking through it fully, and the destination remained undefined. In the months following that October evening, subtle signals emerged that suggested a relationship in cautious reconstruction. Harry attended a charity event in London in December, his presence unexpected and unannounced until hours before. William was photographed arriving at the same venue, though the brothers were not seen together publicly. Palace sources, speaking off the record, confirmed that both had been aware of the other's attendance, that the coordination was intentional rather than coincidental. The careful dance continued through Christmas, which Harry did not attend at Sandringham, but acknowledged publicly with a family photograph that included, for the first time in years, a framed image of him with William from their youth. The gesture was small, easily dismissed, but for those analyzing every signal, it represented acknowledgement of connection where previously there had been only studied absence. William's approach to questions about Harry in public settings shifted subtly. Where once he would deflect or ignore entirely, he began offering brief, neutral acknowledgements. Asked about his brother during a walkabout in Wales, William responded that he wished Harry's family well, a statement of such basic civility that it made headlines precisely because it represented a departure from previous silence. The brothers did not speak at every significant moment, did not consult each other about major decisions, and did not resume the closeness of their youth. But they had established a baseline of communication that allowed for occasional contact without crisis or drama. Text messages on birthdays, brief calls around the anniversaries of their mother's death, coordination around family events that both might attend. ensuring that logistics minimize awkwardness. For their children, who would carry the legacy of this generation's conflicts into the next, the implications remained uncertain. George, as the future king, would one day need to define his relationship with cousins who lived across the ocean and had chosen to remain outside the institution. Whether those relationships would be warm, cordial, or distant would depend partly on the groundwork laid by their fathers. King Charles, in the second year of his reign, found himself reflecting on his own relationship with his siblings, on the complicated dynamics that had shaped his generation. He understood that William and Harry's relationship would never replicate the easy partnership they had once shared, but he hoped they might find what he and Anne had developed, a functional respect rooted in shared history, even when daily connection was absent. The institution itself continued its slow evolution, attempting to address the criticisms that Harry's departure had highlighted while maintaining the traditions that defined its identity. Questions about media relationships, about duty of care to family members, about the balance between public service and private well-being, received renewed attention from within the palace structure. Catherine's role in this ongoing story remained complex. She maintained her own relationship with Harry, separate from William's, consisting of occasional messages focused on their shared experience as parents. The Princess of Wales understood that her relationship with her brother-in-law would always be filtered through her loyalty to her husband. Still, she also recognized value in maintaining independent connection where possible. Meghan's position was perhaps most complicated. She had been at the center of many of the conflicts that led to Harry's departure, whether fairly or not. Her reconciliation with the institution, if it ever came, would require addressing hurts that went beyond sibling dynamics to questions of identity, belonging, and institutional responsibility. The brothers' tentative reconnection did not necessarily pave the way for her inclusion, and she had come to terms with the possibility that it might never happen. The geographic distance between the families remained a practical barrier to close relationships. California and London were not day trips apart. The children could not play together spontaneously, could not develop the natural bonds that proximity allows. Video calls, however well-intentioned, cannot replicate the experience of shared family gatherings, of cousins growing up together, or the unconscious intimacy that comes from regular contact. Yet the meeting that October evening had accomplished something that neither brother fully appreciated in the moment, but which would reveal its significance over time. It had broken the narrative of permanence. The estrangement between William and Harry had begun to take on the quality of unchangeable fact, something that had been grieved and accepted as the new reality. By meeting, by talking, by choosing to leave open the possibility of future contact, they had challenged that narrative. The future of their relationship would not follow a single trajectory. There would likely be moments of renewed tension, events that tested whatever fragile understanding they had reached. The fundamental differences in their choices, in their obligations and freedoms, would continue to create friction. William would remain bound to an institution that Harry had rejected, required to defend and represent it, even when doing so conflicted with personal relationships. But they would also share moments of connection, instances when shared memory or shared concern about family members or shared understanding of the unique burden they carried as Diana's sons would create temporary bridges across the distance between them. They would navigate their children's milestones from different continents, but with awareness of each other's experiences. They would age into different versions of themselves, shaped by different environments but carrying the same foundational experiences of loss and duty and public scrutiny. The monarchy's historians, when they eventually write the definitive account of this era, will debate whether the brothers' estrangement represented a crisis or an evolution, whether Harry's departure threatened the institution's survival or demonstrated its adaptability. They will analyze the October meeting as an inflection point, the moment when permanent fracture became possible rapprochement.